Snow fell on Christmas Eve, the way silence falls after a prayer, soft, relentless, and heavy with things unsaid, and the town of Coldwater Crossing looked like it was holding its breath as lantern light trembled along the wooden walls, and the wind dragged its nails across the planks. And there, pressed into the shadow between the livery and the abandoned mercantile, sat Eliza Mayfield, the mail-order bride who had arrived with a single carpet bag and a heart full of borrowed hope, now folded into herself like a letter no one meant to read, her fingers numb around a cloth sack that once held flour but now held nothing but the smell of meals remembered. She had not eaten since morning, not since the boarding-house keeper, tight-lipped and tighter with her coin, had told her the room was no longer hers, because the man who'd ordered her from a newspaper advertisement had sent word he wouldn't be coming, and without a husband's money or promise, Eliza was just another mouth in a hard winter town, a burden no one could afford. So she had walked until her legs shook, until the cold found the thin places in her dress and climbed inside her bones, until she slid down the wall and let the tears come quietly, because crying loud took strength she did not have. She thought of the letter she'd answered months ago, the careful handwriting that had sounded kind, the words that promised a warm home and children laughing, and a man who needed a wife as much as she needed a future. And she wondered how hope could be so heavy and yet so easily dropped, how a woman could cross half a country, chasing a sentence printed in ink and end up counting the cracks in a frozen street, her stomach aching not just with hunger but with shame, because she had believed, and belief, she was learning, could starve you faster than the cold. Somewhere a church bell rang the hour, each toll like a reminder that families were gathering around tables she would never see, that bread was being broken by hands that belonged to one another, and Eliza pressed her forehead to her knees and whispered a prayer she didn't expect God to answer. Not after everything, not tonight, not for someone who felt as small and unwanted as she did. Boots crunched through the snow then, slow, deliberate steps that belonged to someone who knew the sound carried, and Eliza stiffened, fear tightening her chest, because nights like this invited men who mistook desperation for permission. But the steps stopped a few paces away, and a voice followed, low and steady, worn by wind and work, not unkind, but not gentle either, as if gentleness was something it had learned to ration. "You'll freeze sitting there." She looked up into lamplight and saw a cowboy built like the land itself. Broad shoulders under a weathered coat, a hat pulled low, stubble dark against skin reddened by cold, and his eyes, gray and assessing, took in the empty sack, the trembling hands, the hollowness beneath her cheeks. And something shifted there, something like recognition, like he'd seen this kind of quiet before and knew it could kill. His name was Caleb Hart, though she didn't know it yet, a rancher who'd driven a wagon into town with 4 orphaned children bundled under canvas, a man who'd buried more than he talked about, and learned to keep moving because standing still hurt too much, and he'd meant only to fetch supplies and be gone before the night dug its claws any deeper. But the sight of her, alone, hungry, invisible, stopped him colder than the wind. "I'm fine," Eliza lied, because pride was the last thing she owned, and he snorted softly, not mocking, just tired of lies that didn't help anyone. He glanced down the street where a covered wagon stood hitched, a white horse stamping, breath steaming, and from beneath the canvas came the muffled rustle of children shifting, whispering, waiting, and the sound seemed to settle his decision, whatever argument he'd been having with himself. He crouched then, bringing himself to her level, the lantern in his hand throwing warm light across her face, and he said the words that would split her night open like a door she didn't know how to knock on. "Get up, you're coming home." She stared at him, disbelief warring with fear, because home was a word that had betrayed her already, and strangers who offered it usually wanted something in return. But his gaze didn't slide or linger, didn't ask for anything except that she stand, and when she tried and nearly fell, He steadied her with a hand firm and respectful at her elbow. The simple decency of it nearly undoing her, she protested weakly, saying she couldn't pay, that she wasn't what he thought, that she was waiting for a man who hadn't come. And Caleb's jaw tightened, his voice roughening as he said, "I don't care about any of that. It's Christmas Eve. No one's going hungry under my roof if I've got breath in me." He led her to the wagon where 4 pairs of eyes peered out, curious and cautious. Children who'd learned the world could take everything and keep asking for more, and he introduced Eliza as if the matter were settled, as if names were bridges instead of questions, and handed her up with the care one used for fragile things, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders before she could refuse, the smell of wool and smoke and something like stew clinging to it. And when the wagon lurched into motion, Eliza felt the ache in her stomach sharpen at the promise of food, the warmth of bodies pressed close, the soft murmur of children arguing over space and secrets, and she pressed her hands together to stop them from shaking, afraid that if she spoke she would cry, and if she cried the spell would break. The road out of town was a ribbon of white under a sky pinned with stars, and Caleb walked alongside, lantern swinging, his silhouette steady against the dark, and she wondered what kind of man gathered lost children and strangers the way some men gathered coins, not to keep but to spend where. It mattered. The ranch house sat low against the land, windows glowing like eyes that had been waiting, and when they reached it, warmth spilled out to meet them, carrying the scent of onions and bread, and something rich enough to make Eliza's knees weaken, and inside, the children scattered toward the table as if drawn by gravity, while Caleb shrugged off his coat and moved with the ease of someone who knew the work would never end, but meals had to happen anyway. He set a bowl in front of her without ceremony, thick stew steaming, bread torn, not sliced, and she stared at it like a miracle she didn't deserve, until he said simply, "Eat," and the word broke whatever dam she'd built, tears slipping free as she lifted the spoon with hands that still shook, the first mouthful warming her all the way down, filling spaces that had been empty longer than today, longer than this winter, longer than she wanted to admit. She learned then, between bites and breaths, that Caleb Hart wasn't a savior from stories, but a man who did the next right thing because the world didn't give you credit for intentions, that the children, Liam, Rose, Thomas, and little Annie, had lost parents to a fever and followed him home because he couldn't send them away, that there was room here for one more if she needed it, at least for the night, at least until morning made questions unavoidable, and Eliza nodded because nodding was all she could manage, her heart beating hard with gratitude and terror both, because hope, once rekindled, burned hotter than despair and left deeper scars. When it went out, outside, snow kept falling, covering the tracks they'd made into something clean and new, and Eliza wondered, as she watched Caleb ladle stew for the children with the same care he'd offered her, whether coming home was something you chose or something that chose you, whether Christmas miracles were loud or quiet, and whether a man who said get up on the coldest night of the year might be asking her to do more thanks stand, might be asking her to live. Morning came softly to Caleb Hart's ranch, the kind of winter morning that crept in on pale light and quiet resolve, and Eliza woke beneath a patchwork quilt she didn't recognize, listening to the steady sounds of a house already alive, the crackle of a stove, children's footsteps, the low murmur of Caleb's voice, and for one sharp moment panic rose in her chest because happiness felt unfamiliar, like borrowed shoes that might be taken back at any time. But then the smell of coffee and bread reached her, real and warm, and she remembered Christmas Eve, the stew, the blanket, the way Caleb had looked at her not as a problem to solve, but as a person who needed a place to land. She dressed slowly, smoothing her worn dress, bracing herself for the questions that daylight always brought, and when she stepped into the kitchen, the children greeted her with unguarded smiles, Rose tugging at her sleeve to show a ribbon she'd found, Annie climbing onto her lap without asking, and something inside Eliza loosened, a knot she hadn't known how to untie. Caleb stood by the table, hat off, hair rumpled, eyes softer in the morning light, and he said, "Slept," not as a question but a relief, and poured her coffee as if this too were settled. After breakfast, he took her outside where the land spread wide and honest, frost shining on the fence rails, cattle lowing in the distance, and he told her the truth because he didn't know how to offer anything else, that he hadn't planned on adding another soul to his crowded life, that the ranch was work and worry and not much room for mistakes, but that he couldn't leave her freezing in a town that had already turned its back. He told her she could stay through winter, help with the children if she wished, earn her keep if that mattered to her pride. And when spring came, she could decide her own road, no debt owed, no promises demanded. Eliza listened, heart aching at the kindness, wrapped in restraint, and she told him her truth in return. The letter, the man who never came, the hunger that had followed her like a shadow, and she admitted the hardest thing of all, that she was tired of being brave alone. Caleb nodded, gazed steady on the horizon, and said quietly, "You don't have to be," and the simplicity of it felt heavier than vows. The weeks that followed stitched them together in small, ordinary ways. Eliza teaching Rose her letters by the fire, mending coats, learning the rhythm of the ranch, Caleb watching from doorways he pretended not to linger in, the children sleeping easier with another grown voice in the house. And the town noticed, because towns always do, whispers drifting like smoke, some sharp, some curious, until one afternoon the man from the letter arrived, smelling of drink and entitlement, claiming a bride he'd paid for, and fear tried to drag Eliza back into itself. Caleb met him at the gate, calm as winter, and spoke words that ended the matter cleanly and publicly, leaving no doubt where Eliza stood. And when the man rode away empty-handed, the land seemed to breathe again. That night, as snow began to melt and stars pricked the sky, Caleb admitted what had been growing between them, not as a grand declaration but as a choice, that home was something you built, plank by plank, with people willing to stay. And Eliza answered not with fear, but with courage earned the hard way, saying yes not because she was saved, but because she chose to belong. Spring came, and with it a wedding that was simple and true, the children scattering petals, laughter ringing across the fields, and Eliza stood tall, no longer hungry, no longer waiting, knowing that Christmas Eve had not been the end of her story, but its beginning. A night when a stranger said, "Get up," and meant more than movement, meant life, dignity, and a place called home. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you that kindness can change a destiny, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.